How does the Bible, namely the Old Testament, or even, especially the New Testament, but it's more obvious there, how does it all lead up to and point to the person of Jesus Christ? In the Gospels, we have the disciples being led by Jesus through the Scriptures in places like on the walk to Emmaus. But how does the Old Testament anticipate Jesus?
Wow.
Where should we start? New or Old
I don't know. I was just
Testament?
going to say, can I talk about Emmaus?
Yes, you can.
This is his sandbox, but I'm going to play it a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think when I read what Jesus said for those disciples, it says he started with Moses and the prophets, and he showed them how it was instructing and pointing to him. I've forgotten the exact phraseology, but fulfillment of Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, we make a mistake in saying we want to know how every single pericope fits into that story to explain how Jesus is the Messiah. And we've had examples of that all through interpretation history, in Christian history, of trying to explain how every single passage is pointing to Jesus. I like to think in terms of a grand arc that goes through Moses. And when he referred to that, he's of course referring to the Jewish canon, the Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Right. It has three parts. And he said Moses and the prophets. Very often it just says the first two and says, and you know what the rest are. So I think of a grand arc in which, or a trajectory in which everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. But in that arc, across the text of the Old Testament, not every single passage is contributing directly to that arc. There are certain key passages that are messianic passages, or there are even passages in Genesis that set up the coming of a great king from Judah and so forth, that sort of hold the ark up there like pillars that hold it in place. But then there's a grand narrative below that that sustains it, and it's not as though each pericope or paragraph can contribute directly to that arc. So I don't think Jesus was going through and showing how every verse is about him,
Right.
but how the grand arc is ultimately coming to fulfillment in Jesus. So I'll pass it to you, Ben. It's your testament.
Well, what I would say is, what's clear to me from a variety of comments in the New Testament is that the earliest Christians, and I think Jesus as well, saw the whole of the Old Testament as, in some sense, prophetic, always forward-looking. The end of the story of God's people is not done yet, and God is not finished with his people yet. It's one of the reasons why Paul in Romans 11, Paul in Romans 9 through 11 insists that God is not finished with Israel yet, that there will be a day when all Israel will be saved, and it's not yet, because it waits for the return of the Redeemer from heavenly Zion, namely Jesus. But the way I take the New Testament writers viewing the Old Testament is, in some cases, it's foreshadowing what is to come. So Jesus, the priesthood of the Old Testament is a foreshadowing of the priesthood of the heavenly high priesthood of Christ. We can call it typology. We can call it foreshadowing. In some cases, there is a belief in predictive prophecy. This prophecy was said back then by Isaiah, and it's fulfilled in Jesus in this place in this way, okay? Like Isaiah 53, for example. So sometimes they think it is predictive prophecy. Sometimes they think it's just foreshadowing in a broader way what is to come. Sometimes it's a typology. Melchizedek was a type of Christ, the heavenly high priest in advance. So the vision is that all along God has been preparing the way through the people of God and his revelation to the people of God for Christ, our King, our high priest, our sacrifice, right? And all of the Old Testament, therefore, is pointing in that direction, even if particular verses or particular stories don't seem particularly germane to that. If you will, all of these stories on a train that's heading for New Testament glory. All of these stories are on the train, right? And it's not that we need to inspect every single thing that's on the train and say, oh, this is a symbol of this, or this is an allegorical type of this. But what we do need to say is that this was part of God's plan, and the plan is not over before Christ comes. I like what C.S. Lewis once said. He says, when the author of the play steps out on the stage, the play is almost over. right? So when Jesus Christ comes along, we know we're in the last climactic act of the play, and that all of the previous acts that are in the Old Testament were pointing in this direction. But we might not have seen that without the last act, because the retrospective looking back on what's come before illuminates what came before as well as what comes after.